Well, good evening all. So it's a very good event, very good to be here, and I'm very happy to see so many faces, so many of which that I have become familiar with already, but also some new faces. So it's very good. One of the things I tell people, there we go, the noise. You are very often saying these days here in New Zealand about how hot it is. And I got here maybe 8-10 days ago from India. And in India it was hotter. And at least equally humid, but hotter. But I have to say, you know, over the time that I've been here, I've sort of, I don't know if it's a word, but I have Kiwified, or I have become more accustomed to this climate, and it does feel hot to me now. So I've kind of weakened. I'm on my way back to Chicago, which will slap me out of this moment for sure. But I wanted to just share a few thoughts with you this evening. Obviously, it can be a big subject that I talk about, the mechanism of knowing, or the mechanism for knowing. Ideally, from my perspective, the subject will be whatever the size is that we can, in fact, digest. Whatever it is that might be actually usable and meaningful is about the size we'd like to keep it. So, along that line, everybody's come a long way from a busy day. Some people have come long distances to be here with us this afternoon, this evening. So probably one of the good things we can do, just to begin, and just to actually give us an introductory sense of our own capacity to regulate our mental and emotional climate, is just to begin by becoming aware of our breath. You are, in fact, breathing. You may have forgotten it. You may not be paying much attention to it. But as one of the most low-tech devices for getting in touch with a more centered state, nothing beats the breath. You can't buy a meter or a device that beats it if you can actually direct your attention to become aware of its simple rhythm of coming in and flowing out. So anyway, the subject of how it is that we know and what it is that we know. From the point of view of the Theosophical Society's approach, for us as human beings, there are three primary avenues that have traditionally been pointed to. Avenues that are the normal ways that we try to seek out knowledge, but even more than knowledge, to seek out a deeper knowledge that we tend to define as truth. So the avenues that tend to point us in that direction are the familiar ones. Very often people take the approach of trying to understand and deepen their association with knowledge through the avenue of religion. So there are religions that have grown up every place in the world. Each religion is different from every other in terms of its particular dogmas or its particular practices. At a certain level, each religion is the same as the other, in that it always points towards something divine, something of an all-powerful, omniscient, omnipresent nature. So religion is one of these avenues that we travel along. Another familiar approach to knowledge or to truth has been philosophy. the great philosophers of the world. Somebody once said that Western civilization is really nothing more than footnotes to Plato, the great philosopher and also profound spiritual thinker. So religion, philosophy, and of course in our time, probably the dominant influence in terms of our approach to knowledge or truth is science. It seems as if what science says is what we listen to most readily. I mean, quite honestly, my own daughter, she's 24 now, 25, excuse me. She would object heartily to taking away 1 year. But there was a time when we'd talk with her about different things, perhaps even health-related matters. And tell her, Angelique, it's a good thing. You should probably eat more of these leafy green vegetables. It's good for you, all of that. Okay, Dad. And her habits don't change. But then I've had it happen time and time again where she'll come to me and say, Dad, you might be interested in this. It's good to eat these leafy green vegetables. I say, how do you know that? Well, a scientist just recently stated that they have done tests that demonstrate this. So for us, I think very often, unless it gets the stamp of scientific authenticity, it becomes a little bit difficult for us to abide, which is something of a problem because obviously science has very clear limitations, particularly when we start talking about matters of deeper sorts of knowledge. So the normal ways that we know, the things that we know, probably most of us, in the Western world, it is a requirement that you pass through some sort of educational institution. It used to be you could do it at home or not at all, or find some other way to become educated, but now, of course, there is the requirement of a certain level of schooling. So that particular format is one that is designed to impart knowledge. I mean, that's why we go. Knowledge about the world we live in, a variety of things. But if we really think about it, everything that is related to that particular system is something that gives you a knowledge of a second-hand sort, which is to say, the histories that are taught are not histories that you witnessed or participated in. The science that is taught is not the result of experiments that you have partaken in. So it's something that is poured into what is viewed as this empty vessel of this young human being. And if you did really well in that educational system, it was probably because you were able to repeat what was told. Probably except for sports and art, everything in that system is mostly what we would describe as second-hand knowledge, knowledge handed to us. There's another sort, which of course is first-hand, which talks about our own personal experience. That ranges from everything from the physical world to the world of our emotional nature, also to our thought world. These are things that we are intimately in touch with from moment to moment. And in fact, they are things that we have a great deal of authority in terms of choosing much of that inner landscape, the first-hand knowledge. But all of this relates to mostly to outer things, how we react to the environment around us. My particular interest, and probably the focus of something like a theosophical worldview, focuses on a deeper sort of possibility. There is the idea that within each and every one of us there are capacities, there are powers that lay asleep, but they can be awakened. And when they are awakened, we start to find examples in history of great people. People who have come into this world, who have tried to pass on a message about a different way of living. And mainly by the examples that they have set in their lives, but stories always grow up around these people. But these deeper sorts of knowledges have been given names. So you have a certain tradition that speaks of gnosis. Gnosis simply means knowing or knowledge. In Indian spirituality, they talk about Brahma Vidya, which is to say the wisdom of Brahma, the wisdom of God. And this is a depth of knowledge that is quite removed from the ordinary. You have divine knowledge or theosophia. All of these are levels at which we have the potential to know. And in the scriptures of the world that largely speak about the experiences of great people in these realms, it's a very interesting thing to me, at least. One of the ways that I find myself looking at all of the various scriptures of the world, in many ways they are filled with stories. If you look at the Bible, it's one storybook from beginning to end, which is not to demean it in any way. Indian spirituality, the great jewel of the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, where you have the story of a conversation that takes place between Krishna, who is the embodiment of the divine, and begins as a mere driver of the chariot for the great warrior Arjuna. Stories. But in every one of these stories, I am really so impressed because I start to think that these great beings who have come here and lived among us were not only great in their spirituality, but they were also quite clever in many ways. Which is to say, they were very much aware of the audience to whom they were speaking. They were talking to us. And in order to communicate a profound message, they had to figure out how to do it. The fact of the matter is, you have someone like Buddha. Buddha had his experience of enlightenment. He awakened. He saw what reality consisted of. And his initial decision after having this profound experience was that this is something that there is no way I'm going to be able to describe to these people. These people being these people like you and me. He says, no way I can get this across. So his initial decision was not even to attempt to teach it. To have the experience, to allow the consciousness that flows into the world from that experience to affect it however it may, but I'm not going to teach because it's a waste of time. He changed his mind, fortunately for us, and went on to teach. And one of the ways that these great teachers always communicated is in stories. And if you think about it, anyone who has been a parent and you have a small child, what are the ways that you use to fuel their imagination? To start them to think along a certain line. And always stories. These magical stories, these wisdom stories. And with these great ones, what they have done with this childish humanity, us, has been to try to lead us with stories. And so you follow these stories, and you follow it, and it's like a ladder. And you step onto a rung, and you step onto another rung. And you keep on going up the rungs of this ladder, following this story. And eventually, if you follow it in earnest, with these wisdom stories, you'll always end up at a point. And the point is, there is a point where the last rung of this ladder is reached. And there is no next step. The next step that is required then is what is called, we call it stepping out on faith. That we have followed it to a certain point, and then in order to experience what it is that they're talking about, there's another step that must be taken. And for many of us, that's the exact point where we pause. Probably there are a lot of us hanging around that last rung of the ladder. Because these stories necessarily, you hear a biblical verse in the Psalms. They give these indications of what this next step might be like, where it says something like, He utters His voice, and the earth melts. The profound hearing, experiencing of reality causes our conventional views to melt away. And, quite honestly, who wants that? Generally, it takes a lifetime to get to the point where you kind of figure this system out and start to find your place in it and fit. But then to say that there's a deeper reality on the other side of this and commit to experiencing that it's not a step that many want to take. But still those stories are there, and they indicate things. So one of the things that they talk about is that within each and every one of us, there is knowledge of this normal sort. We have the capacity for that. But also there is something that might be talked about as the knowledge of the soul. A much deeper, much more refined sort of voice that's always present for us. And, what is this voice like? What is the experience like? And then you go to one of these stories. You have the Bhagavad Gita is really this foundational tale. You find it across all cultures of a battle. In this case, there's a great warrior, Arjuna, trained in battle. That's his family caste. But this particular battle is a little bit different, because the one that is about to start is a battle between him and people who had been his friends, people who had been his family, people who had been teachers and guides to him were on the other side of that line. And when the horns blew and the battle started, the requirement for him was to go and to do what he does, to fight, to kill, to come out victorious. But faced with this situation, which, except for the inclusion of his own family and teachers, was normal for him, when he looked at it, he couldn't do it. He decided, I can't do this. I will not. I will completely go against my training, against my known duty. I will lay down my arms, and I'd rather have them kill me than kill them. And so he told his charioteer, take me up to the mountain and let me look over the valley below. So that's the setting. A battle that's going to be waged below. That for this moment when the Bhagavad Gita occurs, the actual entire story takes place high above. So they're telling you, there is this elevation And from that elevation, he looks down on the battle as it's about to begin, and he speaks his mind to his charioteer about how he won't do it. And his charioteer listens. And then he responds. And out of the course of this dialogue that takes place between the warrior who had become despondent and his charioteer, it quickly becomes quite clear that the voice of the one who was driving the chariot is actually the voice of the divine, the highest self, speaking to him. And it goes through the various sorts of conversations that they have. First one in the list is that you make a mistake in believing that in any battle that you can either destroy life or that you can create life. All of these lives dwell within me, Krishna, the universal consciousness. You don't either kill, nobody kills, nobody dies. All things cycle within me. So anyway, the stories occur to point our attention toward a deeper way of knowing than the one that we normally embrace. And if we find some value in that, it's something that perhaps stimulates us to look a little bit deeper. So this is one of the ways that that these ability to know is spoken of. So, how is it that we actually know things? In a way, we have to kind of ask a more deep question. And it's probably a question that everybody has asked at some point or another. Basic three-word question that somewhere along the line pops up in our minds and we look for answers. Sometimes it can be a little frustrating and we stop looking for answers. But the simple question is this: who am I? And if we were to be asked that question, the normal answer could be a variety of things, depending on how you feel at the moment. If someone asks, who are you? Oh, I'm a New Zealander, which might apply to half the people here. The rest of you got here to New Zealand and liked it and stayed. But I am a person of a particular nation, is one of the ways we might answer that. So, who am I? I'm from the US. Okay, but is that who you are? So maybe on another time someone asks you that, well, I'm male, I'm a man. Another time they ask you, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a wife, I'm a son. Countless different ways that we can approach an answer to that question, but really if you ask yourself a little bit more deeply, is that true? Now, who is it that answers the question? If you were not from New Zealand, would you still exist? Who am I? I know there is the best place in the world, of course. But if you were from someplace else, and who am I? All of this is just to say this, that most of us, almost all of the time, find ourselves filtering our awareness through a host of different identities, not just one. You talk about having a personality disorder, multiple personalities, each one of us has them. And from moment to moment, we choose which one is effective for the moment. So, identity, none of those things are who we are. So who am I? In the ageless wisdom tradition, there is this idea that has been expressed that the human being, and that's every single one of us, is highest spirit and lowest matter linked by mind. And you think about it for yourself. Highest spirit, lowest matter, and the aspect that links those two together, that bridges those two, is the mind. And so I think for anyone who is seriously engaged in what we might call a spiritual path, it becomes very clear that the ground where we are doing our work is this bridge of the mind. And so then what is the mind? But from the perspective of the Theosophical Society, when we talk about mind, mind is regarded as something that has two specific functions. So it's twofold. On the one hand, it's something that we generally use to process the thinking about the concrete world, the material world. So we're always looking out, we're always considering, we're always processing through this concrete mind. So much like a screen, it's something that can reflect downward. Also, it's something that can be turned to reflect something of this gnosis, this higher dimension. So it has this twofold capacity. In the teachings that comprise much of Indian spirituality, there is this idea that there are organs of knowledge. And if they were to describe what the organs of knowledge are, they would talk about the hand, the eye, the tongue, the ear, the nose. All of the organs of the senses are what are described as the ways in which knowledge comes into us from the outside world. And so if you look at how they work, in every case, with each one of us, constantly, there are sensations that we are experiencing. With each one of those sensations, we find that they produce a response. And that response is either one of pleasure, if there's some color that we enjoy, it's pleasant to us to look on green fields, fields that will be greener after this evening. And I hope none of you left the windows of your car open. So, touch something, if it feels warm and fuzzy, it's something that produces a pleasurable experience. So pleasure and pain are the two feeling aspects that come out of these sensations. So, begins with a sensation, which itself is neutral, becomes a feeling, then it becomes something that we involve our thinking. So the thought then takes place. And so we either like it, we have attachment to it, we have aversion to it, we pursue it, we push it away. So this is the cycle of knowledge movement from without to within. But it also happens in the reverse way. So just as surely as we think about someone that we love, that thought generates a feeling. That feeling often causes sensations where the body even warms measurably. So it's this constant grid, backward and forward. I think in Western civilization, we have very much gotten locked in on mind as located in the head, the brain. There's been a lot of interesting experimentation going on recently in scientific communities. There's a fellow by the name of Dr. Roland McCraty. Actually, we heard a little bit about his work when we were in Palmerston North. He's done some fascinating experiments on what he would describe not as the brain mind, but the heart mind. The heart mind. One particular experiment that they have done that I find quite fascinating. In the literature of Theosophy, it is said that there are three major centers, organs within the body. At the navel, which deals with the desire nature, the heart, which is the spiritual consciousness, and the brain. And the brain is strictly isolated to the intellectual and psycho-intellectual consciousness. But he did experiments related to the heart. And one of the ones that he did was this. When he described it to me, what he said was this. They took photographs, and the photographs were equally divided, so that half of the pictures were pictures of, scenes in nature, or the scenes of a loving parent with a child, or a picture of a little newborn baby, or a kid, things that when you see it, your body, your mind, your heart responds in a certain way. He took another set of pictures. These pictures were perhaps just the exact opposite. So these were pictures of images of war, the after effects of car accidents. He said he tried to push it as far as he could go without actually causing the person who would see it to faint. And so he had these two classes of images. The people who were taking part in the experiment were wired up so that the responses from their heart, the electronic responses from their heart, which he was measuring heart rate variability or coherence. And then he had the brain wired as well. And so what he did was this. The setup for the experiment was that each picture, there was a 10-second gap. And so he would show the picture, and then they would watch the response from the heart and the response from the brain. And so what he found, to my mind, was remarkable. So what he found was this, that before the picture was seen, just like a tiny bit before the picture was seen by the eye, there was a response from the brain. So the brain had some awareness prior. In measuring the heart, what they found out was that more than 4 seconds before the picture appeared, the heart was responding. So if it was a warm and fuzzy picture, the heart was responding with coherence. If it was one of those pictures of violent images, the heart was responding with an incoherent pattern. More than 4 seconds before the picture actually appeared, the heart as an organ, as a physical organ, was responding to that. This is something that is so consistent with the ageless wisdom tradition, which speaks about the heart as the organ of spiritual consciousness. So we live in a model where time and awareness flows from past to present to future. But in this reality within which we also live, but which we perceive so little of, there is also the possibility of time moving from the future to the present. And the heart has this capacity for a dual awareness. They also find out that the heart, in terms of the information it provides to the brain, provides much more information than the brain does to the heart. So there's this dual sense that is present today, that it's not just the brain that is our center of consciousness, but that really when we talk about spiritual consciousness, it's the heart. That the heart is the organ of spiritual consciousness. So there's a heart-mind that is in play. So this is how we know. This mechanism of the mind draws from this heart, draws from the brain. The sensations and the impressions are sent ever more toward the interior. And then we act based on that. So the mechanism of the mind is something that is present from every moment. So here's what we do. Given this sort of scenario, there's always the question, if it's going to be of meaning to us, it's good to know, it's perhaps good to hear, but then what can we do? How can we cultivate the qualities of the mind that will lead us more and more towards some sense of control in life, even towards simple happiness, which is one of the things that everybody is looking for. So there's a cultivation process that I think we can engage ourselves in. There's a simple way that it's been put. Back in the US many years ago, there's a person very much involved in the health field. And he put out an idea that became quite popular, and popular because it's rather obvious to us. The idea being that you are what you eat, is what he said. And so on the level of food, I think that's something that makes perfect sense. That if you take in junk food, your body responds accordingly. But I think for us, as multi-dimensional people, multi-dimensional beings, the idea is a little bit more profound. Because from moment to moment, we are continually feeding ourselves a diet of a varied sort. The foods that we eat, obviously we would like to make them more nutritious because it builds a body of a certain type. But at the same time, every single moment, many of us find ourselves becoming quite irritated with other people who are driving with us on the road. We find ourselves becoming easily angered, perhaps, with people who behave in ways that we don't care for. There are emotions that we find ourselves eating, feeding ourselves with from moment to moment. Hollywood is based on that. The idea that there is a love story or there's a suspense story, and we all like this excitation of the emotions. But sometimes we have to ask ourselves, do we choose wisely? One of the things that's said in At the Feet of the Master, it's a little book, and it talks about the need for us to actually cultivate a state of mind where we are cheerful. In a way, it sounds like fairly Pollyanna-ish advice. Just be cheerful. But I think one of the things that we are very aware of is how much it is that we affect each other. Any of us who have ever had the experience of being in the presence of someone who is very happy, very enthusiastic. That rubs off on you. Similarly, anyone who has had the experience of being around someone who is perhaps down, depressed, you stay around them for a little while, and unless you're very cautious and very aware, you'll walk away, and you'll walk away feeling drained. There is this exchange that is continually going on, that we are a part of. I had the very good fortune, a number of years ago, back in 2011, in the United States, we had invited the Dalai Lama to come and to do a series of programs in Chicago on behalf of the Theosophical Society. He's a wonderful man to be around. What it did for me, I had 2 days where I just kind of got to hang out with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. So, you'd sit down and you'd eat meals with him. And, I'm sort of watching how he eats his food. Is it different from me? Is there a mystical way of eating? I don't know. But one of the things that happened very early on was this. When he was coming into Chicago, we had to meet him at the airport. So he came in on a private plane that we had arranged. And the way it works is that there's sort of like a line. And because we were hosting the program, I was at the front of the line, and then my wife, Lily, and then my daughter, Angelique, as he got off the plane. And I don't know if any of you have seen this particular tradition, but there's this tradition of a simple blessing, where you have a white scarf that you present to His Holiness, or to any High Lama, and he takes the scarf, and as a symbol of blessing, he puts it around your neck. Beautiful. So he gets off the plane, and I'm there, I'm the first one. He takes the scarf, he puts it around my neck. Next came my wife, and then my daughter's there. And, quite honestly, my daughter was very happy to come to the airport to meet His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, not because she really knew who he was. I mean, she knew he was somebody famous, and that was good enough. And she knew it had something to do with spirituality. But she hadn't studied his life. She didn't know much about him. But the way he is, whenever he gets to a younger person, he lights up. I mean, he's lit up all the time anyway, but he lights up. And so he got to her, and he was talking to her. She was just going off to college that year. So he talked to her for a minute, put the scarf around her neck, and then walked on down the line and left. So what happened was this. After he left, all of a sudden, my daughter just breaks down crying. Just tears flowing out of her eyes. And, I come to her and I put my arm around her and I say, Angelique, what's going on? What's happening? And so here's what she said. What she said was, Dad, when His Holiness came up to me, said, the reason I'm crying, when he came up to me and when he looked in my eyes, she said, when he looked in my eyes, I felt so strong. That was it. That what communicated, no words, but the idea that who we are speaks so loudly that people can't hear a word that you're saying. He has obviously taken it to another level. During those 2 days I had an opportunity to be around him. I saw numerous examples of similar things. People who just got around him and different things that you would think are funny just happened. But that's wonderful. And we hold people like this up as special examples, but the message that people such as His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and the tradition that Theosophy comes out of, says that this really is the person that within each and every one of us, that's who you are. The only difference being, do you cultivate it? Do you take the time to become aware of and emphasize those deeper potentials which we've all seen in ourselves? You know, quite honestly, I think we are very much addicted to this thing of looking to experts of a variety of sorts to tell us what is real. So, you know, in medicine you do that, in everything else you do that. And in spirituality, as soon as you find something that speaks to your soul, something that sort of reminds you of something you seem to have remembered a long time ago, far, far away, we start looking immediately, following our old pattern, for the expert, the one who can tell us what we need to feel, what we need to do. But I think really it's a fairly simple process. You know, within each and every one of us, there is this idea, there's this thing called the three truths, that the soul of the soul is immortal, and its future is the future of a thing whose growth and splendor has no limit. You know, this is a blanket truth. So it's not just true for someone who is born in Tibet. The soul of each and every one is immortal, and its future, there is no limit to the growth and the splendor that is awaiting unfoldment. And then it goes on to say that each person is their own ultimate lawgiver. So, I mean, this is where we get hung up, I think. The idea that we have the power to choose. In fact, we have the responsibility to choose, and to choose wisely. So each one is their own ultimate lawgiver, the dispenser of glory or gloom to yourself. And it stops a lot of whining. It stops a lot of crying. When you notice that things may not be going well, and if you think back accurately about maybe why, it's empowering in the sense that it does not have to continue. So these are just basic sorts of ideas. And then it says that the spirit which gives life dwells within us and without. It can't be seen, it can't be touched, it can't be smelled, it can't be heard, but it can be perceived by whoever it is that truly desires that perception. So again, this is not something that is in the hands of the expert. It is in the hands of the expert, except that that's you. That's who you are. Nobody is more aware or more potentially aware of your own possibilities and the limits to those. So how do you cultivate them? I mean, each one of us has had some sort of experience. Sometimes I use this description because I think it's true, that the deepest sorts of spiritual experiences, each and every one of us has had something of that. You know, the ones you read about. And how did it happen? Very often, the scene is this. Any one of us could be standing in our backyard garden, watching a beautiful sunset, watching the sun drop down, and for a moment, just for a moment, We find ourselves so enthralled, so entranced in whatever the beauty is that we're seeing. I mean, it could be little children at play, it could be a flower, it could be a sunset. But you find yourself so engaged and so absorbed that for a moment, all of the thoughts about the problems that you might have, the chores that you have to do, the places you need to be, for a moment, it drops away. For a moment, all of the thoughts about ourselves drop away as we become absorbed in this scene. It only lasts for a moment. We don't hold it for much longer than that. But when that moment ends, we find ourselves looking back. And when we try to describe to ourselves this very special thing that occurred, always we'll say things like, in that moment, I felt happy. In that moment, I felt peace. In that moment, I felt secure. All of these are words that are used to describe really the higher reaches of consciousness. And this is our experience. It's not something somebody tells to us. Everybody has had this experience. The problem is that we have not yet figured out how to extend it. So it's not the norm. And, we get quickly involved in all of the things that we have to do and forget. So the process that is engaged in by those who say that I'm going to take responsibility for moving from where I find myself now, a person who gets irritated with other drivers or whatever my issues are, to someone who has the capacity to move beyond that, is something that we engage in daily, from moment to moment. Let me just ask, and there's no good answer or bad answer, but among all of you, how many of you have something that you do every day that kind of you could call a spiritual practice or something that tries to point you in a spiritual direction, whether it's meditation or art or something that's specifically focused on that? Is there a number of you that have that? So a number do. A number do. One late one. So here's the thing. One of the advices that is given, I have found very often that people describe meditation and its meaning is not clear. For most people, meditation involves a particular technique, a particular way of breathing. And so, there are 1,000 of those. Meditation's a very valuable key, valuable tool. Actual definition of meditation, I've heard when I first wanted to begin meditating, I read books, the normal way you do it. I read books, I listened to people talking about what is meditation. Nobody described it. They talked about how you cross your legs or how you breathe or the thought that you focus your mind on. Techniques. But to actually know what is meditation, nobody could tell me that in a way that sunk in. Until I heard a definition given by this fellow. I think he was from Germany, and he became a Tibetan Lama, quite a high teacher. Lama Anagarika Govinda. And somebody asked him what meditation is, and I loved his answer. Because what he said was that meditation is not what you think. That's good, isn't it? If you get it, it's good. At first when I heard it, I was very new in all of this, and I'm thinking, How does he know what I think? Maybe I am thinking meditation. How can he say? But obviously, while we're thinking, while we're engaged in all the various mental processes, that is not meditation. You're not meditating. What almost every one of us do, every time that we sit down on the cushion, and when the people say, "What were you doing?" "I was meditating." You're probably not, it's not completely accurate. What we were doing 99% of the time is you are sitting and you are practicing meditation. Practicing. You're not meditating, because meditation is that state of consciousness that begins when we pop above the level of thought and thinking. Thoughts never go away. I mean, it's like saying water goes away in the ocean. Thoughts don't go away, but we move beyond our attachment to these various moving things, the contents of the mind. So this is the goal of meditation, but the difficulty is arriving at that goal, obviously. And so they recommend various techniques. Oftentimes within the Theosophical Society, there's, I think, much less emphasis placed on something which I would say is an equally important tool. And the tool is what we would normally describe as prayer. Prayer. I think prayer gets a little bit of a bad rap because of the way it's portrayed in many of the churches and ministries of different types, where regardless of whether you deserve it or not, regardless of whether your behavior has warranted this blessing that you demand or not, we're looking to be given something because we have said the right words, because we're using an age-old formula that is supposed to attract a blessing of some sort. So I think that has kind of diminished the real meaning of prayer. Because honestly, prayer is not that much different from meditation, in the sense that it begins at a certain point. Perhaps it begins with us giving voice, either through our mouths or in our minds, ideally, to our highest aspirations, to our most exalted sense of what the divine might mean. We give voice to that. And what you find is that it begins with an utterance, inwardly or through the mouth. But as we focus on that, you could also say that prayer is not what you think. Certainly not what you say. That the end point of this is that there is a stillness. The deepest prayer that we can say is the prayer of recognition of that which is. That's prayer. And in that state of recognition, there is no difference between a state of meditation and a state of exalted prayer. So that's a tool. All of these things are tools. But, because of the nature of the mind, this mechanism that we have for knowing, it responds to vibration. And so we find ourselves exposed daily to a host of things that would move us away from this deeper way of experiencing. Just turn on the TV, and immediately there are all sorts of ideas, images. In the news world in America, the thing that is said is that when you look for what the leading story will be in the news, the short way that it's said is, if it bleeds, it leads. If it involves some degree of suffering, pain, that's the leading story, because for whatever reason, the diet of a mental nature that we have subjected ourselves to, we find ourselves attracted to this sort of nourishment. We require the excitement of these sorts of scenes until we build a certain sort of nourishment of the emotional and mental nature into ourselves. And we have to make that choice, because it's not going to happen otherwise. So we take time regularly. Why does it have to be regular? Why can't I just sit down quietly, think about those exalted things today, get back to it again in a week or two? Well, because the influence of that sort of thinking or vibration is powerful in that moment. But then you walk out and it's completely contradicted every place you go. And so you have to develop a method, at least early on, of strengthening, of sustaining that. So what I'm going to do, I'll suggest to you, really all of this thought about the mind, about our multidimensional nature, it's nice. It's good to think about. But until it's something that has sufficient meaning, that it's something we're willing to act upon, then it's just like any other nice idea that's soothing for an hour, and then we go back to what it is we've been doing. Simple practice for anyone who doesn't have one of their own, that could take you 20 minutes out of a day. I think very often, for those of you who are on the normal sort of day to night cycle, the morning time is a very important time, in the sense that it's something that colors. The way we start that morning can color the entire day. How it is that we wake up. Somebody's shaking you, or an alarm is shouting at you. Sometimes that makes it a little bit jarring. And so you may start off in a host of ways. But in the morning time is always a good time to find a quiet moment. And as I say, 5 minutes, you can sit down. And a very simple thing, I told you, the most low-tech meditational tool you can have, you carry it with you all the time, and it's the breath. Anybody. You can be on a bus, you can be in bed, you can be in prison, you can be in a hospital, and you're still breathing, but not aware. So you can take just 5 minutes. If you're just starting out at this, you'll find how very hard it is. It seems like a simple thing, but how very hard it is to be aware of each breath as it flows in and as it flows out. You try it. Sounds simple. You're always breathing, but how long can you keep your awareness focused on it? So very often in mindfulness sorts of training, they tell you to focus perhaps on the feeling of the air coming across your nostrils and going out. And if you really look at it, you'll notice, a certain coolness coming in, a certain warmth going out. You start to notice that the breath has a very different rhythm. When you start, the breath has a different rhythm. As you go into it, the breath gets deeper without you trying, without you manipulating. So this kind of awareness of a very basic body process for 5 minutes. And then for the next 5 minutes, try to just allow the mind to be without thought. It's difficult. And the idea is not to try to empty the mind, because as I said, that's impossible. The idea is to sit, thoughts will come, thoughts will go. But thoughts move across the mind just like clouds across the sky. Each one of us has the capacity of watching a cloud and letting go of it, of being aware of its movement, but not feeling as if we have to follow it all the way to the horizon, which is what we do with every thought that takes hold in our minds. So you can watch them come, you can watch them go. 5 minutes, which again, sounds simple. I'll be interested in how you do with that 5. But it's something you come back to. At first, you may not be able to do it at all. Many people I've spoken to about meditation who didn't have any sort of regular practice, tell them to try it and come back. And people have come back to me and said, Tim, this meditation thing, I understand it maybe works in certain places, but it doesn't work for me. And I say, why? What happened? I said, when I started to try this meditation, I started to breathe, I started to try and watch the thoughts. My mind got more wild than it ever had. And so, it's making it worse. It's not making it better. And I always have to correct them in saying, it's not worsening anything. What is happening is that as you actually become somewhat still, perhaps for many people for the very first time, they become aware of how agitated their minds are in their normal condition. It's just that now you're quiet enough, now you're still enough, that you can witness a process that's always going on but unseen because you let it have its way. So, and then 5 minutes, so this is all 15 minutes, and you can make it less if you choose. Perhaps for the last 5 minutes, you can spend that in just sending out a good thought to the world or to someone that you know who might be in need of healing, someone that you know who might be suffering something in their life, where you can just visualize them and see going out from yourself a thought surrounding them, comforting them, quieting them, healing them. It's imagination. It's all in your mind, people would say. But other people would say that everything that is now real was once imagined. And Einstein himself, imagination is much greater than knowledge. So 5 minutes of imagining the well-being of the world, the health of other beings, the happiness that every single being we know is looking for. Imagining that, and imagining yourself as a source of that. It's a powerful thing. So you sit down, and that's 15 minutes. Then you've got the rest of the day. As I say, as soon as you step out your door, people are going to be rushing around. Many influences will be impacting you, so you'll need to kind of refresh some of this. So for many people, they think in terms of at the noon hour is the moment when you check back in. And so morning, you've done your thing. At noon, it's as simple as just thinking back for a minute about whatever that feeling was that you experienced in the morning while you were quiet. And in connecting with that, it becomes alive in you once again. In the evening time, after you have had your day, time to turn in, time to go to sleep, what is the last thing that you do as you're going to bed? One of the thoughts that is quite prevalent, and it applies at many levels, is that the last thing that we have on our mind Actually, in the Bhagavad Gita, they say that whatever was your prevailing thought at the moment of death propels you into the after-death experience, whatever it is. So if it's anger, hostility, confusion, love, that propels you into your next experience. Similarly, when we go to sleep, the last thought, I know so many people that go to sleep with the TV and that actually fall asleep and the TV is still on. And so as you're laying there asleep, the advertisement for the latest car, the advertisement for whatever it is, the bullets that are flying in the movie that you went to sleep on, all of that you hear. All of that conditions your nighttime consciousness. So what's the last thing you would like to carry with you as you move into this state of sleep, where you will be for 8 hours out of your day? And so for many people, they take this particular time to perhaps read something uplifting. No matter what your background is. You know, if it's a religious background, you can find uplifting passages in the writings of your religion. If it's theosophical, same thing. If it's none of those, but you have an attraction to beautiful poetry, there is poetry. The words of a song. Carry that with you. And that will condition your time in the evening. And so you have this cycle. And actually, I'll share something with you, because it's something perhaps not everyone will be able to work with, but it's worth hearing. It's one of these little practice gems from, actually the Dalai Lama is the one who shared this one. Now, you know when you wake up in the morning? When we're waking up, there is a moment. Previously we were asleep, previously we were unaware. Or either we were, when you're waking up, sometimes you're in some sort of dream. But there comes a point where you become aware that you are moving toward this borderline between sleep and being awake. So you're aware that you are awakening, but you're not awake yet. What he suggested, and it's something that perhaps you can experiment with, this borderline state of consciousness is something that you can experiment with, holding yourself in that state. You know, don't pop up above the waters yet, but be conscious and hold it at that state. And then, you know, you'll have whatever your own experiences are with that. But it's a very powerful stage because it's not fully awake. It's not fully asleep, but it is aware. And so there is a great freedom in moving between two very different states of consciousness. And so particularly as we become more developed in this practice of being able to generate positive thought, to generate a healing vibration. It's something that has the possibility of becoming quite widespread. So I just suggest that for your own experimentation. So in working with the mind, obviously, there are certain developments that will take place whether we do something or whether we don't. In the long run, every being that is alive will ultimately be enlightened in the very, very long run. The option that is available to those who choose is to take this unfoldment in hand. And not just because it's something that will cause us to feel good about ourselves. That's necessary. But it's no accident that any one of us find ourselves born into the world at this particular time. It's no accident. It's no accident that you find yourself someone who has some sort of attraction to the possibility of unfolding these deeper powers that are hidden within you at a time when these are the very things that are most necessary in the world. That's not accidental. In Buddhist teachings, they have all these crazy ways of expressing what they talk about is that the human life is precious. Precious human life gained but once has great potential but is easily lost. Empower me to realize this and to cultivate the powers of this mind. That's one way that they have a prayer that puts this idea very firmly in your mind. But we're here at a time when it's unusual in the world, in the history of the world, to have moments that occur when profound spiritual truths from many, many traditions are available. That's not always the case. And yet we find ourselves in the world now. We find ourselves attracted to these profound spiritual truths. When we look outside into the world in which we inhabit, we find contradictions to these deeper truths. We find a world that is in need of a certain level of exposure, not by talking about it, certainly not by going out here and proselytizing and evangelizing on behalf of truth. If you feel like doing that, you can waste your time if you want to. But by cultivating it within ourselves to such a degree that you become an example. I mean, the experience of my daughter and the Dalai Lama. Somebody looks into your eyes, doesn't talk about anything deep, and you feel something transform. That's the power that each and every one of us has, if we accept it. Perhaps it's a little frightening, because we tend to think of ourselves as little insignificant things. So that's why I would just encourage, particularly they say, there are all these different views about the golden age, the dark age, all these different things. In many traditions, this is thought of as a dark age that we're in, ultimately coming out of. But one of the things that's said that is in times like this, there are those aspects of consciousness that respond very immediately when the opportunity is given, when the call is made, not by saying, "Come to me," but by just like a light that is lit, it attracts certain things to it. We can become that light. And so that's why I would encourage not just the study, not just the exposure to the ideas, but at the stage where we find ourselves, I think the practice, the application, the experimentation. We have the best equipped laboratory that could ever be provided. And that's the laboratory of our own heart, of our own mind. We need to use it. So anyway, I think that's about what I've got for you on the mechanism of the mind. I do thank you for your attention, and I'm very thankful for the rain. It was beautiful. All right, thank you all.